No suit today for this video, and there's a special reason why. You know, I remember the day I gave up on myself as a writer, and it was right here in this office. Ever since I was, I think, about 16, I considered myself to be a writer. I wrote my first novel, a fantasy adventure novel, at 16, and I wrote probably half a dozen since then. I went to college mostly as a backup in case the novels didn't sell, which we all know they didn't, but also because I wanted to study the craft of writing, study literature that came before me, and it was there that I was first introduced to teaching at the college level and discovered a joy in that, and the fact that that was a nice backup for the novels not selling went hand in hand. But I continued to write, and when you're a writer, the rule is write every day or almost every day. Keep writing and keep sending that work off. Well, the rejection slips over the years, piled over a decade, over, gosh, I think 15 years, so high there was no point in keeping them anymore. The half dozen novels, the dozens of short stories I wrote, it seemed as though no one was even reading them. I kept getting the rejection letters that were form letters, that were from manuscripts submitted to the slush pile. And I began to feel a despair. It was one thing if people were reading my work and saying, you know what? Maybe this just isn't good enough. Maybe this isn't what we're looking for, or maybe this isn't something that people will buy. But the idea that I would spend so many hours down here in this office writing, and no one would even read except for my friends and family what I produced, it just seemed so pointless, and the outside world was just beckoning to me. And one day I finally said, you know what, I think I'm done. And a few years later, I started my YouTube channel, and that has been like a dream come true for an artist. But with the Patreon, amazingly, impossibly, you wonderful people actually submitted the request that I read one of my unpublished stories. And at first I was a little bemused by this, but then it dawned on me. In a way, my reading this story here today in this video is almost like it being published. In fact, quite frankly, there's probably more people going to experience my story that stick around and watch this video than would have ever picked up one of those literary magazines that are $25 at the Barnes & Noble bottom shelf, had the editors even ever read one of my stories, which they did not. And that to me is terrifying. I literally am doing this very last minute in that I've spent several days kind of poring over my work, selecting the one that I think is right, knowing that this is probably the only time I'm going to do this. And, well, I picked one out. Thank you for what you've given to me in this, through this. The Patreon support, the T-shirt sales, the views on the videos, the incredibly touching, kind words that you've all given me. I thought that was it. There's nothing more I could possibly get from this community. And then you do something like this for me? I'm speechless, so I'll simply just read. This is a short story called The Old Switcheroo, and it's a special short story to me because it's the one that was read by someone other than my parents and my wife. It was what got me into grad school, so at the very least the grad school committee read it and felt that I was worthy to at least attend grad school for it. And that was very important because I wouldn't be a professor, let alone the professor, had I not been accepted into graduate school. So this is a special story for me, and I hope you enjoy it. But you don't have to. That's the nice thing about literature. The Old Switcheroo, and I'm going to be reading this without any editing unless the battery dies on me on the camera. It's not that long. And so if I stumble or fumble, I won't edit it. I'll just go back and correct it as though I were giving a real reading, which I suppose I am. Thank you. The Old Switcheroo. If I were a plant, I'd be a wisteria. Aspiring but easily intimidated, expected to climb old buildings and cover the cracks. It occurred to me, as I gripped the doorknob to room 450, that I should not be thinking of plants. After all, my father was dying. But after all, the plants were not growing. The wisteria had been a compromise with my wife, who'd wanted the garage in our backyard painted. I felt it would be too expensive, and as soon as she brought up the cracks, an image of blossoming vines unsprung in my head. The cracks would enable a vine of some kind to climb up to the roof, blanketing the eyesore in a, no doubt, stunning array of green artistry. So 3 months ago, I went to the nursery, and later that day found myself planting $80 worth of wisteria and envisioning the end result just as things were beginning. Like I said, my father is dying. Better to say, my father was dying when I bought the plants and is still dying. We've all come to accept this. He's as good as dead. Every time I visit him, I prepare myself for the likeliness that this will be the last time I speak to him. As I entered his room that day, my father lay so deeply in his bed, it appeared as if he'd melted into the bedsheets. He didn't sit up when I entered, only coughed in recognition. I sat down next to him and tried to find the ears of the father who'd raised me within the pancaked cartilage that wrapped around his head like a hat. Purple splotches ran down his neck, each hosting a forest of black wiry hairs. I recalled the time my daughter asked, "What is Grandpa dying of?" To which I helplessly replied, "Everything." "Russell!" His voice crackled like a junkyard Victrola. With great effort, he lifted his head so we were face to face. "I want you to have a child." "Dad," I said very slowly, "I have a daughter. Her name is Faye. Would you like to see a picture of her?" I reached for my wallet and was startled by a loud moan emanating from my father. I started to call for the nurse, but then I realized he was sounding his frustration with me. "Another child," he spat, letting the first word roll off his tongue like rejected hospital food. "Another in addition to Faye." His eyes stole a glance at mine, and before I could apologize for thinking him senile, he proclaimed, "I shall die with my wits about me." I fell back into my chair and focused all attention on his tortoise-skinned feet protruding from under the covers. "I'm going to have more kids," I told him, "just not now." "When your first-grade teacher made you wear a dunce hat and stand before the whole class," he rose from his pillow, and I could hear joints popping. "I took her before the principal." "Second grade," I intoned. "That was in second grade." "First grade!" He shot out his index finger so fast I feared it might snap off. "Don't tell me what I already know, and don't tell it to me wrong." "And when Myrtle, the turtle, died?" "Please don't bring up Myrtle." "I told your mother, God rest her soul, that you didn't shed a single tear, when in fact, you blubbered away for an hour." He lurched forward another inch, something I would not have thought possible. "I should only hope," he continued, "you'll weep half as dramatically for my own timely passing, though I sincerely doubt this will be the case. That doesn't equal baby, Dad. Those weren't tickets for a prize to be redeemed upon deathbed. Kara and I have a plan, which includes when we'll bring another life into this world." "I want a grandson," he insisted. "A grandson, no less." He lurched again, and I thought surely these dramatics had lost their impact on me by now. But I quickly realized this last contortion had been involuntary, and as he slammed his wrists into the bed railing, fumbling for the call nurse button, I rushed into the hallway shouting for a doctor. They administered a new IV drip, sedated him, and got him into a reclined position again. And I realized I should have just said yes and not agitated him. So as he lay back, drifting into an unconsciousness he might never awaken from, I told him, "Yes." I whispered, "Sure, Pop. I'll go home right now, and I'll tell Kara the good news. We'll have a baby boy, and what's more, we'll name him after you. In fact, I think his middle name should be after Granddad. How's that sound? Michael Samuel Levinstein. That will be his name. Everything will be okay now, right?" He nodded once, farted twice, and drifted off into an oblivion of darkness. "And how was your day?" my wife asked when I got home. "I may never see my father again," I told her solemnly, "but at least I'm making it possible for him to pass from this world into the next with a great joy in his heart." So that's the setup, okay? And now here's the pitch. For the last year, well, over a year now, half a dozen bushy stumps of wisteria have lined the back perimeter of my garage, and though they've blossomed and wilted twice now, they have not had a single inch of vertical ascent. My wife has not said a word about this, and I wonder why she hasn't complained when the garage looks worse than ever. My father, by the way, had only been suffering from gas, if anything at all, on the day I promised him a male heir. Yes, he's still alive, but his condition keeps deteriorating. Every other week, I get a phone call from that Dr. Sherman, and I hear how Dad's white blood cell count has dropped, or the infection in his lungs has spread, and this on top of that, on top of this, on top of that, and I ask, how much worse can it get? There has to be a falling out point, a point of no return. When is he going to die? Soon, the doctors whisper. Soon. In the meantime, he's lost all hearing in his left ear. So I come in as often as I can, which is more often than I'd like, and stare at that shriveled prune of a face and listen to the seconds tick. A year passed, with relative silence between the two of us. Occasionally he'd ask how the baby was coming along. At first, I tried to dissuade him with tales about how difficult it is to inseminate a woman these days, but his impatience became so overwhelming, I finally blurted out that Kara was pregnant. That shut him up, and all was well again in the kingdom. Now if only he'd die. So last week, he broke our sea of silence with the clicking of his tongue. I thought he'd stop after a minute, but he seemed intent upon maintaining a rhythm or something. Click, 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 smack of the lips, click, click, and so forth. I excused myself to use the restroom, and when I returned, I found a nurse hovering over his bed. This is it, I thought. He kicked it while I was sitting on the can. I rushed into the room and worried about how I'd have to lie to my own daughter. Faye, sweetie, I held Grandpa's hand as he gently slipped from this realm into the unknown. But the nurse turned and left the room, revealing my father was still firmly rooted among the barely alive. "Do you know what she told me?" he asked. I shrugged and began glancing at my watch. "Today is April 27th. He presented me with both his hands, palms open, as if the date had some significance between the two of us. "Yes," I peered at him quizzically. "And?" "Russell, you are 1 month overdue." "Overdue on what?" I asked. Unpaid bills, bank statements, insurance, and finally, Kara. "I will not believe your wife is in the 10th month of pregnancy." I had promised him on his deathbed, but that was now 5 deathbeds ago. 6 if you can't count my last trip to the bathroom. When I'd promised him I'd sire a son, I didn't expect he'd last 10 months. "Where's my grandson?" he now demanded. "Oh," I stammered, him. He was born, yes, but that was when I think it was your colon became spastic, and the doctors advised keeping the shocks and surprises to a minimum." "Where is he then?" "The doctors won't allow it," I fumbled. "The CADs." "Won't allow?" "Yes, well, you see, Dad, the hospital has rules about young children, babies, and whatnot. But I can bring you a picture." "I want to see my grandson immediately." He began coughing. "And I want that Dr. Stevens." "Sherman, it's Dr. Sherman," I insisted. "Stevens? I want that Dr. Stevens in here pronto. Exceptions can be made to every rule. Exceptions were made. Dr. Stevens, how on earth had I come up with Sherman, gave me the permission to bring young Michael Samuel Levenstein in for a visit with his grandfather. I begged him to reconsider. I wanted the doctor to proclaim with stone-cold authority that no child was allowed past the lobby on the first floor. The doctor was confused, or was it bemused, by my fervor, but took no hesitation in telling my father that he could indeed see his grandson. What choice did I have? The following Monday, I presented young Michael Samuel to my father. I thought the old man would die on the spot. He began mumbling gibberish or some incomprehensible tongue. His eyes glassed over. His face flushed a red so deep it must have contained every last drop of blood in his body. Finally, he asked to hold the baby. Reluctantly, I handed the child over. My father's first comprehensible words were, "I want to see him again." I returned Junior to my friend James, who thanked me for babysitting. "Any time," I told him. "Maybe again next week?" Later that day, I picked my daughter up from school an hour. Later that day, after about an hour, I picked my daughter up from school. I did not mention meeting her younger brother for the first time. Instead, I surprised her with a trip to her favorite vegetarian restaurant. Across the street from the Green Bean Beret, there is another restaurant called the Blue Lips. What first caught my attention was not its name, although this did not entirely go unnoticed, but the fact that painted on its windows were wisteria vines. I had never, before buying some of my own, heard of or so much as seen a leaf of wisteria. Now, not a day goes by where I do not notice the insipid little plant wrapping itself around railings, climbing a trellis, consuming a front yard, or painted elegantly on the windows of a restaurant. Now, I've never actually eaten at the Blue Lips, not even spied one of their menus, but I often find myself obsessed with staring at its front windows, memorizing every detail as I sit here in this booth in a restaurant across the street, eating the worst vegetarian food ever made. "Dad," Faye says to me after taking a loud chomp of her garden burger, "my teeth hurt." "Your what?" I said, trying to recall that misheard word. "What did she say?" "Teeth," she repeated, and, understanding maybe my lack of clarity, pointed at her mouth. "Your teeth," I asked. "What's wrong with them?" "They hurt." And my 9-year-old daughter looked at me like I was a fool of the sorts 9-year-olds can only imagine. She opened her mouth and I looked inside. Globs of chewed-up garden burger were mashed between every possible gap and crevice within the human word hole. A sluice of saliva rushed up from under her tongue and freed what might have been a corn kernel from the dark recesses of her back molars. Faye put a finger to one of her incisors, and it wiggled slightly, mashing up the gooey food mass which surrounded it. "Ah," she said. "It's loose," I told her. Again I received a look for her that indicated I was being of no use. "Yes," I heard her thinking. "I know it's loose. I know it hurts. Do something about it." "I'm showing Mommy as soon as I get home," she informed me. It was upsetting that my daughter had found me utterly useless in such a personal matter. I was her father, after all. Wasn't I supposed to know how to make the pain go away? There was always the dentist, but that too was someone removed from me, and what I desired was to be the sole provider of solace for her. "You want some sweet potato fries with that, Sweeney?" I asked Faye. "No," she said sadly, and left the rest of her meal uneaten. Later that night, I asked my wife, should we make an appointment with the dentist? "Of course," Kara replied. She seemed shocked at the idea that I wouldn't have done this already. "It's just a loose tooth," I told her. "It'll come out in a couple of days." "Russell," She furrowed her brow. Faye already lost that tooth. This one's not supposed to be loose. So we went to the dentist. Hello, the voice buzzed over. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, a voice buzzed over the phone. This is Dr. Stevens. May I speak with Mr. Levin? My father, I interrupted. Phrases crashed upon one another in my mouth. How is my father? Is something wrong? But they each fell short when I realized I knew their answers. My father had passed away. There was silence on the other end. I closed my eyes and thought of the man Michael Levinstein had been. There was a time when he'd shown up after a Little League game, dressed in a white Dixieland suit. It was an odd sight, him standing there on the field, wearing one of those red and blue striped straw hats. I never asked him why he had dressed that way. Or maybe I did. It was true I couldn't remember. But what holds with me still is the taste of those snow cones we got after the game, because rarely does something taste exactly how it looks. Those snow cones tasted blue. My father, I repeated. Yes, said Dr. Stevens. There was a dramatic rise in his white blood cells over the weekend. My mind was in a daze as he listened to the details, My mind was in a daze as he listed the details of my father's miraculous recovery. I couldn't find the words. I don't want to suggest such a thing so soon, but if he continues on like this, I believe we can upgrade him to an outpatient status within the next few weeks. You're saying he's better? He can come home? My bowels churned. He's on his way, Dr. Stevens proudly pronounced. Kara beckoned at me from the bedroom. Our television program was on. I nodded and concluded with the doctor. They wanted me to come in as soon as possible. My head dropped. The carpet became a wall before my fallen eyes. I must be losing my mind, I said to myself. My father is going to live, and this carpet looks gray. Hastily, I fumbled for the light, turning the small brass switch at the lamp's base. I squinted and examined the floor again. It was white. In the dimness, it had only appeared to be gray. I phoned my friend. I was wondering if I could babysit Junior again tomorrow, I asked him. For how long? As long as possible, I replied. Kara came in, motioned once more for me to join her. I shut off the light as I left the room, and the carpet returned to gray. The waiting room at the dentist's office was filled with pictures of smiling faces. Men, women, and children of every ethnicity were smiling at me, wide-eyed and white-toothed. Bolted to the wall was a rack of brochures, where yet more people smiled on the cover, under headings such as tooth decay, gum disease, oral surgery, and dentures. I did not feel any of these matters were something to smile about, but given that none of these people had the slightest speck of discolor on their pearly whites, not to mention braces, caps, crowns, fillings, rotting teeth, or any of the other nasty things listed on those pamphlets, I assumed the lack of tooth trouble was a cause for smiling. I was happy to hear from the dentist that my wife had been wrong. Faye had not already lost the loose incisor that was ailing her. Dr. Toothman, not his real name, which was Smith, but I always hear the name Toothman in my head when I look at this guy, informed me the tooth had to come out. There was a hook or extension or something that was preventing it from fully coming loose. Faye would be in pain until the tooth came out, so with a twinkle in my eye, I ordered that the tooth must come out. Dr. Toothman was in the process of pulling Faye's tooth when the nurse, or receptionist, entered the waiting room and asked me to come in and talk with Faye. She's frightened, she told me. But the nurse had been wrong. It was not Faye who was afraid, but rather the doctor. The walls of the room were red with a black diamond pattern striping them. In the center of the room was the dentist's chair, and in it Faye sat upright in such a fierce manner it reminded me of my father when he had demanded a grandson. In the corner of the room, Dr. Toothman nervously looked between Faye and the syringe he held in his hand. Upon seeing me, he took a cautious step forward, and that's when Faye screamed. "Put the needle down," she demanded. "She's afraid of needles," I said, biting down on how obvious that was. The doctor retreated to his corner, but was unwilling to let go of the syringe. I explained to Faye, he said in a quivering voice that was trying to be friendly, that I can't pull the tooth until she's had some Novocaine. He held up the needle, and again Faye screamed. I told her that it wouldn't hurt. Faye screamed again, and let me clarify on the scream. It was dry. The scream did not choke back tears or haphazardly vibrate out of fright. It was a strong scream. Then suddenly, I realized how strong my daughter was. I had always thought it was Kara and I who allowed Faye to be a vegetarian, allowed her the peace of mind of her parents following her eating habits. This was wrong. It was Faye who controlled us, told us how we would now be eating. Sweetie, I smiled at Faye, we can't pull the tooth without... That's a lie, Daddy, she said flatly, her eyes never leaving the shaking mass of Dr. What's-His-Name. Can you pull it without the Novocaine? I asked him. I suppose so. He wanted to say more, but before he could work up the courage to stand up to me, or stand up to Faye, my daughter made her proclamation. Pull the tooth! She opened her mouth. No one moved. Pull it now, she insisted. I would not have thought a man could move that fast, but quicker than my eyes could allow him, the dentist put the syringe on a counter and was on top of Faye. She screamed a more normal scream, but this too was stifled. There was no pop, I had expected there to be one, and suddenly the dentist was presenting me with Faye's tooth. It was indeed small. He wiped his brow and began putting cotton padding in Faye's mouth. I had never been more proud of her. I looked at my daughter. Our eyes met, and she smiled. She was lying in the huge chair, her pain gone, and I was reminded of my father. His pain was gone too, but not in the way I had been hoping for this last year. He was not dying. He was getting better. Soon enough he'd be home, and things would change. Maybe Faye would let me eat meat. Maybe Kara and I would have a son soon. And maybe the wisteria would grow. I had come to the hospital with the intention of telling my father the truth about his grandson. I really had. For the last year I had wished my father dead, so both of us could get some peace. But now that he was recovering, I was overwhelmed with a desire for him to live. And as I reached for that elevator button, I visioned him keeling over with shock over the news that he in fact had no grandson. So I turned around full circle and got Junior again. When I returned to the hospital, baby in hand, the electronic doors parted for me like they might for royalty. Hello, I said to the receptionist. I'm Russell Levenstein. I'd like to take my boy here, I winked at the baby, to see my father, Michael Levenstein, room 450. An exception has been made. She punched a computer keyboard and readjusted her glasses. With a pout on her lip, she shook her head. I'm sorry, she said, but you'll have to talk to the doctor about that. Picking up her telephone, she paged Dr. Sherman. He took me into his office, and the two of us had a seat. I'm so sorry, the doctor said, repeating the receptionist's words. I thought your name was Stevens, I told him. You corrected me on the phone? Yes, he folded his hands. That was Dr. Stevens you spoke with, but there had been a mix-up with the phone numbers. He has a patient by the name of Michael Levinson. My father had made no recovery. 2 nights ago, as I received the news of Michael Levinson's return to health, Dr. Sherman told a man I have never met about the death of my father. I cannot recall when the thought occurred to me, and I'll take no guess at it. The moment of its conception doesn't matter. I wondered if those plants were growing, only I'd never noticed because I watched them too closely. Could they reach the top without my realizing it? Every day I water the wisteria. Twice a month I put a cup of plant vitamins in the soil, but only once in a while do I think about growth. Thank you.